Negotiator's Dilemma is one of the most powerful gear sets in the division. Do you think you know all of its quirks? Let's talk about it. Hey agents, it's Dispatch and let's do some math. Alright, Negotiator's Dilemma. Targets are marked when we hit them with a crit, and every crit will do that damage to the other enemies that are marked. Keep in mind this only activates when we crit, so we want to be critting as much as possible. Enemies take and transfer the full mark damage even on the bullet that they get marked. 60% critical hit chance is a must, don't go with anything less. This also means that we want the fastest firing weapon possible. Let's look at our damage graph to see why. Alright agents, to demonstrate this, I've got two DPS builds in my spreadsheet. First one's got an AK, second one's got a Vector SBR 9mm. Yes, I didn't put the right amount of rounds in the mag, but that's okay, it's not really relevant for this. We've got a bunch of BS multipliers in here. We're not really concerned with that. We're concerned with when we're going to crit and how that's going to affect our damage. So over here we got the bullet. So the first bullet happens at time 0. Second bullet happens at another interval. Notice that the time of these bullets is different because the SBR has half the firing interval as the AK, and so that is going to affect when we're going to get those marks and therefore when we're going to get that bonus damage. So the Vector hits the 2 times multiplier if we got the backpack at bullet number 4, which happens in half the time as the AK's bullet number 4. This is assuming, of course, that we're critting every other bullet just to make things easier on ourselves. And so you can see that in the time that it takes the AK to stack its 3 times damage, we've got a lot more Vector bullets that have had that damage. So to demonstrate that on our damage over time graph, you can see over here, this is without Negotiator's Dilemma on the right, the two builds. You can see it's fairly linear, not much going on here, pretty standard. But over here you can see the Vector is creeping up, and then boom, you can see that it starts hitting those increases faster than the AK. So it starts to pull away much sooner than on this chart. That is why, just like with strikers, it is better to run a high rate of fire weapon to get those marks and the extra damage sooner in the mag. This marking mechanic is essentially determining the uptime of the talent. The longer it takes us to mark each enemy, the less the talent is active. So at the beginning of a fight, we want to mark our targets quickly, and as targets die, mark new targets to make sure we have the maximum targets marked at all times. At the end of a fight, we're also going to get a bit of a drop in damage, but that's usually the point where we have the least amount of incoming damage and are in the least amount of danger. Remember that the damage that is transferred to other enemies is not a crit, meaning we won't get 3 times as many procs of fast hands or clutch or whatever talent is proccing on crits. The Negotiator's Dilemma talent just takes whatever damage we did to the marked target and transfers that directly to the other targets. So how do we maximize the damage? One would immediately think crit damage. This makes sense at some level since we're critting a lot and that damage will happen when we crit. However, Negotiators transfers the full damage of whatever that bullet does to the other enemies, not just the crit damage. This means that whatever multipliers we have on the enemy that we are shooting will transfer directly to the other targets, even if they aren't subject to that multiplier. The easiest examples of this are health damage and damage to targets out of cover. If we are shooting a Chunga, it is out of cover and taking that health damage multiplier. That raw damage number gets transferred directly to the other marked targets even if they are still in cover and still have armor. Theoretically, you could spec heavily into crit chance and headshot damage even for massive damage transfer. Those headshots will proc a massive damage number that will transfer to the other enemies even though we're not hitting those enemies in the head. In this case, you theoretically don't want to have damage to armor and damage to health on your build at the same time. Choose one and focus on those enemies that are taking that specific damage type. This gear set allows you to get consistent kills and high sustained damage, as you're almost always going to have one enemy available to shoot. In addition, we can also take weapons with lower optimal range because the transfer of that damage doesn't take range into account, and if we're focusing on enemies in close proximity, we are getting a higher hit percentage without wasting time repositioning, so that increases our DPS tremendously. Shotguns and SMGs actually do very well in this regard, and here's why. Shotguns and SMGs are some of the highest DPS weapons in the game, with their main weakness being range, which is mitigated by negotiators. In addition, shotguns crit once per trigger pull if any of the pellets crit. This means we're basically guaranteed to crit every shot. SMGs have higher rates of fire than most other weapons, which means faster marking. Now back to negotiators in general. On the one hand, the talent helps with target priority, since we can ensure that we've at least marked the high priority target, and will be doing consistent damage to them even if they aren't in our field of view or are behind cover. Enemies that would be prime examples of this are sniper dogs, who do massive damage while we're exposed, snipers, drone controllers, and grenadiers. There's also a slight nuance here. Robodogs will take transferred damage straight to their health, bypassing their armor plates. While this should work for Chungas too, I couldn't seem to get results out of it. Regardless, most Chungas are really good for spraying damage, as they're always out of cover and very easy to stun by breaking their chain. On the other hand, sometimes there are high priority targets that need to be killed ASAP that negotiators will struggle against, like melee Chungas and some rushers. Let's talk about how much damage negotiators actually does. Once procced, it gives us an average 72% amplified damage just from the talent if 3 enemies are marked with 60% critical hit chance. This doesn't include gains or losses from brand and minor attributes, doesn't include the backpack or chest talent. This average also doesn't take into account larger uptimes of our special multipliers like health damage, damage to armor, headshot damage, and damage to targets out of cover. So we can push this a little bit higher, but it'll also be tempered slightly by marking, as we mentioned earlier. Compare this to Strikers, which does 65% amplified damage, and it takes time to stack. Negotiators works much better mathematically and in practice. There's one final piece that makes Negotiators top tier in damage. That is, enemies can be staggered by transfer damage. So not only are you getting more damage than Striker, you're also getting that little extra bit of survivability by being able to stop incoming damage from 3 to 5 enemies briefly. We should be killing enemies so quickly that this should stop most damage even on Heroic. Interestingly, this acts like Hunter's Fury. Hunter's Fury staggers the enemies for much longer, but has a range limitation. Hunter's Fury also gives you armor on kill, but that's balanced out by the fact that Negotiators does so much more damage. Also, Negotiators doesn't have a range limitation on its stagger. So, to summarize, Negotiator's Dilemma builds are top tier for DPS. We should build it to target out of cover enemies, either health or armor, with a high rate of fire weapon. Remember to keep as many enemies marked as possible and work within your optimal range. With these tips in mind, we'll be shredding heroic content. That's all for today, agents. Please consider subscribing to the channel to join us on our journey as we uncover all the little quirks of this mightily mathy game. Like if you like these investigations, dislike if you didn't. If you got any things that I missed, put it in the comments. Thanks, agents, and remember, until next time, this has been Dispatch. Take care out there.